Let me kick this off by saying that this is not going to be an overwhelmingly positive review, nor an especially negative one. I'm sorry to be one of those contrarian buggers sitting on the proverbial fence, but the reality is that I both liked and disliked Metro Exodus in almost equal measure. If you want my honest opinion right out of the gate, Metro Exodus is fine. It's fine. It's not amazing and it's not awful. It's just kind of okay, neither Marmite nor Hershey's chocolate. It's the absolute epitome of a game that I'm happy to play whilst it's on, but wouldn't be overly fussed if I just stopped playing it. Let's go about this in a less vague and dismissive way. Exodus is the third and possibly final game in the arc of Artyom, a 27-ish-year-old Russian gentleman with a crippling social anxiety disorder that means he only speaks in loading screens, and makes conversations with him super sodding awkward. Set roughly 6 to 12 months after the events of Last Light and spanning an entire year, Exodus chronicles the trials and travels of the Spartan Order aboard their pilfered train, the Aurora, as they leave Moscow in search of somewhere safe to foster a future for humanity. Along the way, they come across a colourful cast of characters and mutants as they scour war-torn Russia for the last remnants of their government and sanctuary. As the culmination of a story that's been steadily building over the past decade, with Metro 2033 being released as an Xbox exclusive back in 2008, followed by the multi-platform Last Light in 2013, Exodus feels, at least mechanically, like the pinnacle of the series' gameplay. For the most part, it's a smooth and refined experience, taking the perfectly competent gameplay and immersive HUD elements of previous games, tweaking them ever so slightly for what amounts to a less clunky experience overall. In terms of the way the game actually feels to play and the typical flow of the mechanical pacing, Metro Exodus plays like a first-person shooter with a little extra faff for you to keep an eye on. You have a little more to work with than your average game, and even previous Metro games, from taking care of your equipment and your gas mask, to managing supplies, swapping out weapon modifications on the fly to better deal with the area that you're in, changing out your equipment, and so on. Like previous games, Exodus does a great job of being a fully self-contained story. That is to say that although knowledge of the previous games, or perhaps even the books, is certainly advantageous, it's not necessary in order to enjoy the game's story and narrative progression. As someone with decent knowledge of the games, but little love for the books, not because I dislike them, but more because I just haven't read them, I find it's pretty easy to drop into any one of the games and have a decent idea of what's going on. Although I would absolutely recommend playing the previous two games, partly because they are incredibly good, but also because having that knowledge of Artyom's struggle thus far paints a vivid picture of what exactly it is that we're fighting for and against. Having said that, there are a few specific things that I want to focus on that are closely tied to the look, feel, and general design of the previous games. The Metro games have never felt like experiences heavily focused on the mechanical aspects of gaming itself, but rather on the emotions and experience that emerge in the wake of apocalyptic chaos. They are tales of humanity, of the struggle to survive, the natural turmoil that develops when pockets of idealised individuals start to clash, and so on. The gameplay, while solid and enjoyable enough, has always felt like little more than the steering wheel with which to drive the narrative vehicle. Part of this comes down to the game's linearity, and it's here that Exodus's first shortcoming starts to simmer. Its mechanics are simple and elegant, as with its predecessors, but rather than being integrated into a methodically slow, calculated crawl through the depths of the Metro, the game throws you in at the deep end in the manner of an experience that just wants you to get on with enjoying the pretty landscapes it's crafted for you. Now, first things first, it's important to be aware that the game's marketing is telling something of a white lie. This is not a sandbox game. I'm not even sure that whoever produced the marketing materials for Exodus even knows what a sandbox game is. GTA is a sandbox game. Saints Row, Just Cause, Elder Scrolls, Fallout. Games with huge maps that have a linear main story, but the entire world is open to you from the get-go, leaving you free to roam to your heart's content and ignore the main story for as long as you like. Metro Exodus is not a sandbox game. It is a series of small, reasonably open maps connected by linear points of narrative progression. It's less of an open world than it is a series of platforms connected by tunnels. Sure, there's a world map, or several, in fact, but unlike all of the aforementioned games, there aren't plentiful side quests or things to see. There's little in the way of variety within each map, meaning that they tend to feel more like Minecraft biomes separated by a lengthy railway of a loading screen in between. Don't get me wrong, there are things to do, as it were, but they are very few and far between, and for the most part, what you'll more than likely be doing is exploring, crafting, and uncovering the stories buried within the post-apocalypse. Still, despite what may come across as lambasting the developers' decision to broaden the Metro horizons, the overall aesthetic and attention to detail in each of Exodus's maps is still absolutely outstanding. 4A's ability to craft a believable world on the cusp of extinction is unrivaled, with stories unfolding naturally as you traipse through the wasteland, digging through discarded boxes and upturning corpses. You might come across a downed aircraft, for example, finding a nearby note that dictates the last healthy survivor has gone to find help, despite having a heavily injured leg. A little further up the road you can find a rotting corpse with a heavily damaged leg and a makeshift crutch nearby. Or how about the charming little secret tucked away within an electrical box puzzle that rewards you with an upgrade for your suit? An upgrade that you rip straight from the still twitching body of a mutant. The look and feel of Civilization's remnants has always been one of the series' strongest aspects, and that's no different here. Even so, as what I honestly consider to be a direct result of this attempt to make the series open world, the first hour or so is a rushed and somewhat haphazard mess. During my first run of the game, I genuinely had no idea what was going on in this opening hour, in part because the game hurtles towards its first open area with such breakneck speed that it puts its own train to shame, but primarily because NPCs are constantly talking over one another. I have no idea if this is intentional or not, but I strongly suspect it isn't supposed to be quite as bad as it is, and this is one of my biggest sources of contention with this game. I want to take a moment to quickly explain something that's quite important here. For various medical reasons, I struggle to differentiate and process sounds and voices and the like if there is too much noise going on at once. For this reason, I tend to play video games with the subtitles on, since even though I don't need them most of the time, they're handy to have if something happens that means I can't hear what the characters are saying. I can glance at the subtitles, take it in, and move on. It isn't something that I rely on by any means, but I'll admit to being quite glad that the vast majority of modern games have subtitles on as standard. I bring this up because although Metro Exodus has subtitles, the sheer frequency with which characters talk over one another means that half my time was spent staring at the bottom of the screen trying to figure out who was saying what at any given moment. The result of this meant that I failed to really build a bond with any of the characters because I was too busy trying to divide my attention between what was actually happening on the screen and what people were saying, and struggling to really grasp the game's opening gambit because it was too busy trying to be explosive and dynamic at the same time as having three similarly accented people with very gruff voices all shouting at once. Now, I appreciate that this isn't the experience everyone will have, but if this was a deliberate attempt to show the chaos and disparity people would develop in these kind of situations, they've certainly captured the feeling of incomprehensible nonsense an apocalypse would bring. People talking over one another is a perfectly normal occurrence and it can be used to great effect when portraying stressful situations. But this happens so bloody often in Exodus that it feels like the game is accidentally accelerating dialogue triggers at times. Somebody will start talking, another character will butt in, the original person will carry on all while the new speaker is still talking. It's an absolute mess in places and I do not accept that this was a deliberate choice. So there's little else to talk about with regards to the gameplay, which is great as always, and the scenery, which is also fantastic, even if the way you traverse it isn't necessarily outstanding. And all that's left is the story. Now, the Metro games generally deal with a series of miserable, stark and horrifying themes involving the clash between humanity and the Dark Ones, and the former's seemingly insatiable desire to destroy itself, the slow decay and eventual death of the world as well. It's been mentioned, though I wouldn't say particularly well clarified, that the nuclear apocalypse was a result of war between humanity itself, and that the Dark Ones emerged in the aftermath. Exodus's premise is based on the fact that the Spartan Order, amongst others, have known for some time that they are not the only survivors and that there is a habitable world out there, far from the nuclear fallout. Aside from the rushed and slightly messy opening, the rest of the game follows a half-and-half non-linear/linear structure. In your more open maps, the game tends to deal with the immediate issues, for example, the threat of the cult in the first area that you visit, rescuing Anna from a fall into a bunker and similar matters. You gather survivors, scavenge for resources, and make choices that determine the fates of certain companions. Like previous games, your routes of progression affect the ending. It works extremely well, and each outcome that comes about as a direct result of your decisions feels like it makes sense in the overall narrative, but for the sake of spoilers and potentially a future longer video. I won't say any more on that matter. The game's second half is considerably more linear than its first half, and it's here that I think it shines the brightest. Although the more open areas have their moments, the weight and oppressive feel of Metro is never more certain than when you are crawling through tunnels, hiding from monsters, and saving your precious resources. The second half is where all of the game's fine-tuned mechanics come into perfect play, and though there are a small handful of rocky moments involving some particularly irritating water-based enemies, the drive towards a more linear third act is considerably more involving and much more interesting. Whilst I do believe there is something here for everyone, new gamers or returning fans alike, my honest opinion is that the game suffers massively for attempting a less linear approach to its storytelling. Whilst it does at times tie into the game's themes and search for a new home for humanity quite well, it is also often a glitchy and somewhat contrived mess that on console suffers from long loading times and extremely poor AI when not confined to small areas. Exploring is fun, navigating the wastelands can be enjoyable when you're not being bombarded by enemies, and discovering the stories of those who came before you is, as it has always been, thoroughly harrowing. Metro Exodus is a strange mix of the best of its predecessors and the worst of its peers. If this is the final game in the series, then it is a loving, if not incredible, send-off to one of gaming's darkest secretive gems. If it isn't, then Exodus is an interesting experiment and doubtlessly an educational stepping stone on the path to a true open-world Metro game. For now, I would recommend waiting for bug fixes, and perhaps waiting for next year's full Steam release. But if you're not fussed about the story, then you'll probably be right at home in its solid mechanics and impressive world. Just remember, conserve your ammo, craft for survival not slaughter, and if your teammates tell you to be quiet, maybe consider the possibility that they might know what they're doing.